The winter of 1881 had sunk its teeth deep into the Montana Territory, a season of unforgiving white that seemed intent on scouring the land clean of anything that dared to stand against it. Snow fell not in flurries, but in a relentless, suffocating sheet, burying fences until only their topmost posts peaked like forgotten grave markers. The wind, a banshee wailing from the distant peaks, tore through the broken aspens and cottonwoods, stripping them bare, carrying with it the icy breath of 1,000 miles of wilderness. In the long, frigid nights, when the moon hung like a chip of ice in the bruised sky, the mournful cries of wolves echoed across the valley, a sound that spoke of hunger and the indifferent cruelty of nature. Every dawn was a challenge, every sunset a gamble. Eliza Ward knew this winter intimately, perhaps too well. She was a widow, barely in her late 20s, but the lines etched around her eyes and the perpetual clench of her jaw made her seem older, seasoned by sorrow. Her small homestead, nestled precariously in a dip of the land, was a testament to her stubborn will. A cabin, a half-collapsed barn, and a few barren corrals were all that remained of her husband's ambitions. Last winter, Jacob had ridden out in a similar blizzard, chasing a stray steer, and never returned. They found him days later, a frozen sentinel against a snowdrift, his dreams and his debts still clinging to his stiffened fingers. Now, Eliza fought tooth and nail to keep the place alive, to keep herself alive, against the relentless siege of the elements. Her days were a brutal rhythm of survival. She would rise before the first hint of gray light, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin. The fire, kept alive by a few smoldering embers, was her first battle, coaxing new life from the dying coals, feeding it kindling until a small, tentative flame flickered, was a victory in itself. Then came the endless chore of wood. She was not a big woman, but necessity had granted her a wiry strength. Her hands, calloused and cracked, often bled from the bite of the axe handle and the splinters of pine. Each log she wrestled into the cabin felt like a triumph, a small reprieve against the encroaching cold. Hunting was another grim necessity. The rabbits were scarce this winter, burrowed deep, their tracks erased almost as soon as they appeared. She carried Jacob's old hunting rifle, a heavy, ill-balanced thing that kicked savagely against her shoulder, and walked for miles on snowshoes she'd fashioned herself, scanning the stark landscape for any sign of movement. Often, she returned empty-handed, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach mirroring the ache in her heart. When she did find a rabbit, a meager, shivering scrap of fur, it was a cause for quiet, grim celebration. That meat, along with the few potatoes she had left and a diminishing sack of beans, was all that stood between her and the starvation that seemed to stalk the edges of her property like a hungry wolf. She prayed, not with fervent pleas, but with a quiet, desperate resignation, that the storm would break, that the snow would cease, that spring, distant and improbable, would finally come before her meager stores ran out. Her thoughts often drifted, unbidden, to Jacob. She would be hacking at a stubborn knot of wood, or stirring a thin gruel over the fire, and a memory would rise, sharp and unwelcome. He hadn't been a kind man, not truly. He'd had a way of looking at her that made her feel small, insignificant. His promises had been as fleeting as smoke, his ambitions grander than his capabilities. He'd talked of striking it rich, of a sprawling ranch, of a life of ease instead. He'd brought only debt and disappointment. She remembered the way he'd gambled away their small savings, the harsh words when she'd protested, the time he'd sold her mother's locket, the only thing of true value she possessed, for a bottle of cheap whiskey and a lost hand of cards. "We need the money. Eliza," he'd snarled, his eyes cold and distant, already half drunk. She'd felt the shame then, a bitter, burning sensation in her stomach, knowing that their neighbors, those few hearty souls scattered across the valley, whispered about Jacob's failures, about how he was dragging Eliza down with him. And then there was the dying cow, a bony, ailing creature that had been their last hope for milk and butter, left to starve in a half-built corral while Jacob chased phantom fortunes. He'd left her with nothing but the shack, the snow, and the heavy weight of his failures. A part of her, a dark, secret part she rarely acknowledged, had felt a grim relief when the news of his death had come. One afternoon, as the blizzard intensified, painting the world in a blinding, furious white, Eliza was struggling back from the woodpile, a heavy log clutched in her mittened hands. The wind tore at her clothes, stinging her exposed skin. She stumbled, nearly dropping her burden, and looked up, squinting against the stinging flakes. That's when she saw it, a dark, unnatural shape, huddled near the lean-to of her barn, half buried in a drift. Her heart leaped with a sudden, primal fear. Bear? Wolf? Her hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across her back, but the weight of the log made it awkward. She dropped the wood with a thud and slowly, cautiously, approached the shape, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. He lay crumpled against the snow-covered planks of the barn, his body stiff and unnatural. A wide-brimmed hat, heavy with snow, obscured his face, but she could make out the thick canvas duster, frozen rigid, and the worn leather chaps. A gun, its handle slick with ice, was still holstered on his hip. He looked like a statue carved from ice and shadow. Eliza hesitated, her mind warring with itself. Every instinct screamed at her to leave him. He was a stranger, a drifter. He could be a thief, an outlaw. He could be trouble, the kind of trouble she'd spent the last year trying to outrun. Her homestead was her sanctuary, her last refuge. Bringing a stranger inside, especially a man with a gun, was an act of profound foolishness. But then she saw the faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest beneath the layers of frozen clothing. He was alive, barely. The raw, red patches on his exposed hands and face spoke of frostbite, deep and unforgiving. He was dying, slowly, out here in the storm. Against all reason, against the cold, hard logic of survival she had learned. Eliza knew she couldn't leave him. Perhaps it was the echo of her own loneliness, or a flicker of forgotten humanity. But something compelled her forward. She couldn't let him die like Jacob, alone in the snow. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the drift. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice thin and reedy against the wind's roar. "Can you hear me?" There was no response, only a faint shiver that ran through his rigid frame. He was a big man, heavy with clothes and the dead weight of unconsciousness. Dragging him was a monumental task. She grabbed him under the arms, digging her heels into the snow. Grunting with effort, inch by agonizing inch, she pulled him away from the barn, across the short, snow-choked distance to her cabin door. His boots scraped against the frozen ground, his inert body a terrible burden. Her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned, and the cold bit deeper. But she kept going, driven by a fierce, desperate will. Finally, she reached the cabin, her own body trembling with exhaustion. Opening the heavy wooden door was another struggle, but she managed to prop it open with a stray piece of firewood, then heaved him inside, letting him collapse in a heap on the rough plank floor. The air inside the cabin felt almost warm by comparison, but still bitingly cold. Her fire, neglected during her outdoor ordeal, had dwindled to embers. She moved quickly, kicking the door shut with her foot, then piling on fresh kindling and a split log, coaxing the flames back to life. Then she turned to the man. Stripping his frozen clothes was a gruesome business. His duster was a solid sheet of ice, his trousers stiff as boards. She had to cut away some of the fabric with her hunting knife, her movements clumsy with haste and fear. His skin, where it was exposed, was mottled with purple and white, a chilling testament to the cold's depredations. He was lean, wiry, with the hard-muscled frame of a man who worked with his hands. She noted the calluses, the sun-darkened skin that now looked dangerously pale. His face, when finally revealed, was rough-hewn, stubbled with a week's growth of beard, and etched with lines that spoke of a life lived outdoors, perhaps a hard one. A faint scar cut across his left eyebrow. She worked methodically, stripping him down to his long johns, then wrapping him tightly in every blanket she possessed. 2 thin woolen ones and a thick buffalo hide she'd inherited from Jacob. She dragged him closer to the sputtering fire, positioning him so the meager heat could reach him. His breathing was shallow, ragged, but still there. She pressed her fingers to his neck, feeling the weak, thready pulse. He was alive. She had saved him. For now. Hours passed. The blizzard raged outside, its fury undiminished. Inside, the cabin grew warmer, the fire a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Eliza sat on an overturned bucket, watching him, listening to the rhythmic hiss and pop of the burning wood, and the man's labored breaths. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, but she fought it, unwilling to sleep with a stranger, a potentially dangerous stranger, lying unconscious on her floor. It was deep into the night when he finally stirred. A groan, low and guttural, escaped his lips. His eyelids fluttered, then slowly, painfully, opened. His eyes, a startling blue, were unfocused at first, hazy with pain and confusion. He blinked, trying to make sense of the rough timber ceiling, the unfamiliar surroundings. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were stiff, protesting. A jolt of pain, a flicker of memory, seemed to pass through him. He looked down at himself, at the blankets, then realized his clothes were gone. His hand instinctively went to his hip, searching for his gun, but it wasn't there. His eyes snapped to Eliza, who was now sitting rigidly, rifle across her lap, watching his every move. His gaze was sharp, wary, defensive. Where am I? His voice was a rasp, thick with disuse and cold. Eliza held the rifle steady. My cabin, Montana Territory. Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth. And your gun is on the mantel. Unloaded. She paused. You were freezing to death by my barn. I brought you in. He stared at her, the information slowly sinking in. The cold, the snow, the barn. A faint flush of color, barely perceptible, touched his pale cheeks as he realized the extent of his helplessness and her unexpected charity. He was naked beneath those blankets, reliant on this small, fierce woman. I see. He tried to sit up again, wincing. His head felt like it had been cracked open, and his muscles screamed. He looked at the frostbite on his hands, then at Eliza. His expression still guarded, but a flicker of something else, gratitude, perhaps, or simple bewilderment, entered his eyes. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Eliza said, her voice still hard. I didn't do it for charity. I did it because I didn't want to find a corpse on my property when the thaw comes. His lips tightened. The initial gratitude seemed to drain away, replaced by a familiar defensiveness. Name's Caleb. Caleb Boone. Eliza Ward. She didn't offer a hand, didn't soften her gaze. 2 strangers, trapped by the indifferent hand of nature. Their first exchanges as cold and awkward as the air around them. You got any clothes I can borrow? Caleb asked, pulling the blankets tighter around him. He felt acutely exposed, vulnerable. Your clothes are drying by the fire, Eliza replied, gesturing with the rifle barrel. They'll be stiff as boards by morning. Not that it matters. You're not going anywhere. He looked out the small, grimy window. The blizzard was a swirling vortex of white, a furious tempest that obliterated the world beyond the pain. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the very timbers of the cabin. Escape was unthinkable, impossible. He understood then. He was truly trapped. A heavy silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the relentless roar of the wind. Eliza continued to watch him, her rifle still across her lap, her eyes the color of winter ice. missing nothing. She saw the faint scars on his knuckles, the deeper, faded one above his eyebrow, and the way his jaw worked, as if he were trying to keep a lid on a simmering anger. Physical scars, yes, but she sensed others, deeper ones, etched into his very being. A man who had seen too much, done too much, perhaps regretted too much. Caleb, for his part, studied her. The thinness of her frame, the weary slump of her shoulders, the smudges of dirt and soot on her cheek. But he also saw the defiance in her eyes, the set of her mouth, the way she gripped that rifle. She was alone out here, fragile and yet fiercely unyielding. He sensed a profound loneliness in her, a quiet desolation that mirrored the unforgiving landscape. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, cutting off all avenues of escape, severing them from the world. Inside, the silence grew heavy, thick with unspoken thoughts and the tension of two wary strangers. Each breath they took was visible in the freezing air, a fragile cloud that dissipated quickly, leaving only the cold and the vast, unsettling quiet. They were two solitary souls, stranded in a sea of white, bound together by the arbitrary hand of fate and the desperate need to survive. The gray light of morning did little to pierce the gloom inside the cabin. It was a pale, watery thing, filtering through the single dirty window pane to reveal a world that had not been granted a reprieve. The blizzard, far from abating, had deepened its fury overnight. The wind's howl had settled into a steady, menacing roar, and a fresh layer of snow had been plastered against the glass, obscuring all but the most indistinct shapes. A low, groaning creak from the roof timbers above served as a constant reminder of the crushing weight of the snow, a sound that grated on Eliza's already frayed nerves. Caleb was awake, sitting on the floor with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his back against the rough-hewn wall. His clothes, stiff and cold, lay in a pile nearby. He had the haunted look of a man who hadn't slept well, his blue eyes clouded with worry as he listened to the groaning roof. "I'll be leaving at first light," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. It was a statement of intent, a refusal to accept the reality of their situation. Eliza, who was tending the small fire, didn't bother to look at him. "First light came and went an hour ago," she stated flatly. "There's nothing out there but a white grave. You'd not make it 100 yards. He knew she was right, the stubborn pride that drove him, the ingrained instinct to keep moving, to never be a burden, was at war with the simple, brutal truth of the storm. He was trapped. They were trapped. The knowledge settled in his stomach like a cold stone. Eliza moved with a grim, deliberate purpose. She was taking inventory. From a small root cellar accessible through a trap door in the floor, she retrieved her entire store of food. The sight was pitiful. 3 medium-sized potatoes, their skins already beginning to wrinkle, a small, precious jar of lard, half empty, and a cloth sack containing a few handfuls of dried beans. That was it. She laid them out on the small, rickety table, a stark tableau of their predicament. "This is what's left," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It will have to last." She didn't say for how long. They both knew the answer was indefinitely. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, the blanket still clutched around him. The cold in the cabin was a physical presence, seeping through the floorboards and the chinks in the walls. "I can help," he offered, his voice a low rumble. "That door of yours is hanging on by a prayer, and you'll need more firewood than what you've got." He gestured to the small pile of logs by the hearth, a pile that seemed to shrink every time he looked at it. Eliza's back stiffened. She turned to face him, her eyes as cold as the winter sky. "I don't need your help. I've managed this far on my own." Her pride was a shield, a fortress she had built around herself since Jacob's death. To accept help, especially from a man, a stranger, felt like a surrender. It felt like admitting she was weak, that she couldn't survive. It was a vulnerability she could not afford. "Ma'am," Caleb said, his voice patient but firm. "I'm not questioning your ability, but I'm a man sitting in your cabin, eating your food. The least I can do is earn my keep. It's either that or I sit here and watch you do it all. I wasn't raised that way." She stared at him for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out in the cramped space. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the deep-seated distrust. She saw the quiet resolve in his, the simple, unyielding logic of his words. Finally, she turned away without another word, a dismissal that was not quite a refusal. He took it as permission. Donning his still damp, frigid clothes was an ordeal that left his skin aching, but he did it without complaint. He found Jacob's old tools in a corner, a rusty saw, a hammer with a cracked handle, a few bent nails. He set to work on the door first, which hung precariously from a single leather hinge. The wind rattled it in its frame, letting in a constant, knife-edged draft. Eliza watched him from the corner of her eye as she portioned out a meager handful of beans to soak for their supper. She watched him from the window as he braced himself against the wind, using salvaged boards from the collapsing barn to reinforce the door frame. He worked with a quiet, efficient competence, his movements sure and economical despite the biting cold. He didn't ask for her opinion or her help. He just saw what needed doing and did it. A part of her was resentful of his intrusion, of his silent judgment on the state of her homestead. But another, smaller part felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring of gratitude. The draft from the door had been a constant torment, a thief of precious heat. Now, with the frame secured and the gaps plugged with rags, the cabin felt fractionally less cold. When he finished with the door, he picked up the axe. The woodpile was dangerously low. He swung the axe with a steady, powerful rhythm, the sharp crack of splitting wood, a reassuring sound against the howl of the storm. Eliza stood at the window, her arms crossed tightly, watching his broad back and the spray of wood chips against the snow. She felt a knot of conflicting emotions tighten in her chest. It had been so long since a man had done a man's work on this property. Jacob had been full of talk and short on action. This stranger, this Caleb Boone, was the opposite. He was a man of few words and decisive action. It was both a comfort and a terror. The tension between them began to thaw in small, almost imperceptible ways over the next day. As he came inside, shaking snow from his duster, his face red with cold, she had a tin cup of hot, black coffee waiting for him. It was a luxury, brewed from the last of her carefully hoarded grounds. But the gesture felt necessary, a silent acknowledgement of his labor. He took it without a word, his gloved fingers wrapping around the warm tin, and the look he gave her was one of genuine gratitude. Later, he noticed a shutter banging relentlessly against the outside wall, its latch broken. Without being asked, he went back out into the storm and, with numb fingers and a piece of scavenged wire, secured it. The rhythmic, maddening banging that had been the soundtrack to Eliza's lonely nights finally stopped. The silence it left behind was profound. That evening, as they shared a thin, watery stew of beans and a single diced potato, the silence felt less like a wall and more like an empty space waiting to be filled. "You're a long way from anywhere," Eliza said, more a statement than a question, as she stared into her bowl. Caleb nodded, chewing slowly. "Was headed for the logging camps up north. My horse gave out a few days back. I was trying to make it to the next town on foot when the storm hit." He paused, his gaze distant. "I was a ranch hand, down in Wyoming, for a time." "What happened?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. It was too personal, too forward. He didn't seem to mind. He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his weary eyes. "Trouble," he said simply. "A dispute over a card game. A man got angry. He drew his gun. I was faster." He took a deep breath, the memory still raw. It was self-defense. The sheriff knew it. But the man had family, powerful family. They put a price on my head, said I murdered him in cold blood. So I ran. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. Been running ever since, running from the ghost of a man I never wanted to kill. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Eliza felt a pang of something akin to sympathy. He was not the dangerous outlaw she had first imagined, but a man haunted by a single, violent moment. I know about being haunted, she said quietly, her own voice barely a whisper. She found herself telling him about Jacob, something she had never spoken of to another soul. She told him about the promises of a grand life, the slow, agonizing reality of debt and failure. She told him about the lies, the whiskey, the way he sold off every piece of their life until there was nothing left but shame. He didn't just leave me with nothing, she finished, her voice thick with a bitterness she had long suppressed. He made me feel like I was nothing, like I deserved it. Caleb listened, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he simply nodded. Some men are good at making a woman feel small. It's the only way they can feel big themselves. It was a simple observation, but it struck Eliza with the force of a revelation. He understood. In that moment, they were no longer just a widow and a drifter. They were two people, bound by shared suffering, their pasts laid bare in the flickering firelight of a snowbound cabin. As night fell again, the cold deepened its assault. It was a living thing now, a predator that stalked the corners of the room, seeping through every crack. The fire, though well fed with the wood Caleb had chopped, seemed to offer little more than a small circle of warmth in an ocean of frigid air. Eliza huddled in her thin blankets on her cot, her body racked with shivers she could not control. Her teeth chattered, a relentless, rattling sound in the quiet cabin. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve what little body heat she had. But the cold was relentless, seeping into her bones. Her lips had taken on a pale blue tinge, and her hands, when she looked at them, were shaking uncontrollably. Caleb, sleeping on the floor near the hearth, was woken by the sound of her chattering teeth. He sat up, watching her in the dim light. He saw the violent tremors, the way she was curled into a tight, desperate ball. He knew the signs. This was more than just being cold. This was a deep, dangerous chill that could steal the life from a person. He rose and moved quietly to her side. "Eliza," he said, his voice low. She flinched, her eyes flying open, wide with alarm. "You're freezing," he stated simply. "You need more warmth than that fire can give." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "We could share body heat under the blankets. It's the fastest way to get warm. The only way, in this cold—" Eliza stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words through the fog of cold. Share body heat? The implication was immediate. Shocking. To lie beside him, a man she barely knew, to feel his body pressed against hers. The shame of it washed over her. A hot, suffocating wave that was almost as powerful as the cold. She thought of Jacob, of the marital bed that had become a place of duty and disappointment. The thought of being that close to another man, of that kind of intimacy, even for survival, was mortifying. "No," she whispered, the word a puff of white vapor. "I can't." She turned away from him, pulling the thin blanket tighter. A useless gesture against the profound cold. It was a refusal born of shame, of a deeply ingrained sense of propriety that felt absurd in their current circumstances, but was no less powerful for it. Caleb stood there for a long moment, then retreated to his spot by the fire without another word. A silent respect for her refusal. But the cold was merciless. An hour later, Eliza was no longer just shivering. She was in a state of near constant, violent shaking. Her thoughts grew sluggish, her movements clumsy. She was losing the fight. And then it happened. A large, resin-heavy log in the fireplace, burned through at its center, suddenly shifted. It rolled forward, tumbling from the andirons and crashing against the fragile stone facade of the hearth. There was a sickening crack, a shower of sparks. and then a cascade of loose stones and soot as a section of the chimney wall collapsed inward. The fire was smothered in an instant, its light and heat extinguished under a pile of rubble. A cloud of acrid smoke filled the cabin, but worse than the smoke was the immediate, terrifying drop in temperature. The cabin's one source of life-giving heat was gone. The predatory cold, which had been held at bay, now rushed in from all sides, and the room became a tomb. The last of Eliza's fortitude shattered. The fear of freezing to death, the same fate that had claimed her husband, was now a stark, immediate reality. The shame, the pride, the fear of this strange man, it all evaporated, burned away by the primal, desperate need to live. She began to tremble not just from cold, but from sheer terror. She looked across the darkened room at Caleb's silhouette, a shadow against the dim white light of the window. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged, broken thing, a whisper that was barely audible over the wind. It was the sound of a soul surrendering its last defense. "I'll starve if you don't touch me tonight." Caleb, who had been about to try and clear the rubble, froze. The words hit him with a physical force. He turned slowly, his face unreadable in the dark. He saw her shivering form on the cot, a small, desperate huddle of blankets. He saw the absolute, raw desperation that had forced those words from her lips. He hesitated. This was a line he had not wanted to cross. He was a man running from his past, trying to keep his soul clean of further complications. This woman, with her fierce pride and her deep well of sorrow, was a complication he could not afford. But the sound of her teeth chattering, the visible, violent shaking of her body, overrode his caution. This was not about desire. This was about life and death. Slowly, wordlessly, he moved to her cot. He lifted the edge of the heavy buffalo hide and slipped in beside her. His body still clothed, he pulled the blankets over both of them, creating a small, sealed pocket of space against the brutal cold. He felt her flinch as his arm went around her, her body as rigid and cold as ice. Then, tentatively, he pulled her close, pressing her shivering back against his chest, wrapping his body around hers. Outside, the snow pounded against the roof, and the wind screamed its fury. Inside, in the absolute frigid darkness, two strangers clung to each other, sharing the last, most precious thing they had left, the simple, desperate warmth of a human touch. Morning arrived not with the dawn, but with a subtle lessening of the oppressive darkness. The wind had quieted its manic shrieking, settling into a low, mournful moan that seemed to seep through the very logs of the cabin. A profound, unnatural silence filled the small space, the kind of silence that follows a long and terrible fever. The storm had not stopped. The snow still fell in a thick, hypnotic curtain outside the window. But its initial fury had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world muffled and still. Eliza woke slowly, reluctantly. The first thing she registered was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that was utterly alien to her recent experience. It was a stark contrast to the biting cold that had nearly claimed her. For a moment, she allowed herself to sink into it, a purely animal comfort. Then, memory returned in a brutal, scalding rush. She was not alone. Her body was pressed flush against Caleb's, his back to her front. Their legs tangled beneath the heavy blankets. His arm was draped loosely around her waist, and she could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The intimacy of their position sent a jolt of raw shame through her, so powerful it was like a physical blow. This was the closeness of a husband and wife, a closeness she had not known since Jacob, and even then, it had rarely felt like this. This was a warmth born of desperation, a bargain made with survival. But her body did not know the difference. Carefully, so as not to wake him, she began to extricate herself. Every movement was slow, deliberate, her muscles tight with tension. She slid from beneath his arm, pulling away from the heat of his body. and the cold of the cabin instantly rushed in to reclaim her. She shivered, but it was a shiver of more than just cold. She rose from the cot, keeping her back to him, her movements stiff and awkward. She could not bring herself to look at him, could not meet the eyes of the man who had held her through the night. The memory of her own cracked whisper, her desperate plea, echoed in her mind, a testament to her utter defeat. Caleb was already awake. He had been for some time, lying perfectly still, feeling the warmth of her against him. He had felt the moment she tensed, the subtle shift in her breathing that signaled her return to consciousness. He was caught in a maelstrom of his own conflicting emotions. Guilt gnawed at him. He had taken advantage of her desperation, even if it had been at her own request. The feel of her, small and fragile in his arms, had stirred something in him, something he had thought long dead, a protective instinct, a flicker of tenderness that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. He was a drifter, a man running from ghosts. He had no right to such feelings. He watched her move about the cabin, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the floor, on the walls, on anything but him. He knew he had to break the suffocating silence. He pushed himself up, the cold hitting him like a slap. "The fireplace," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I'll see if I can clear it." It was a clumsy attempt to impose normalcy on a situation that was anything but. He went to the hearth and began the arduous task of pulling away the fallen stones. Eliza busied herself with the beans, measuring out a portion even smaller than the day before. They moved around each other in the cramped space, two celestial bodies locked in a tense, silent orbit, careful not to collide. The firewood was nearly gone. A few split logs remained, a pathetic bulwark against the unceasing cold. Caleb looked at the pile, then at the groaning roof. "We need more fuel," he stated, the words hanging in the frigid air. Eliza knew what he meant. There was only one source left. The barn. It was already half collapsed, a skeleton of rotting timbers. But it was wood. It was survival. The thought of cannibalizing their own meager shelter was a new low, another step down into the abyss. They bundled themselves against the cold and ventured out. The world was a featureless expanse of white. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, powdery blanket that made every step a struggle. The barn stood like a ruined cathedral, its timbers coated in a thick layer of ice, working together. They used the axe to pry loose frozen boards from the leeward side of the structure, the sound of splintering wood sharp and violent in the stillness. It was brutal, exhausting work, and the cold was a constant, physical assault, stealing the breath from their lungs and numbing their fingers to the bone. As Caleb wrestled a particularly long plank free, he saw something else half buried in a drift near the far wall of the barn, a familiar shape, stark and tragic against the snow. It was a horse, frozen solid, its legs sticking out at unnatural angles, its head buried. It must have been his own mount, the one that had given out on him, which in its final throes had sought the meager shelter of the barn before succumbing. He stood over the carcass for a long moment, a grim feeling settling in his gut. It was a sorry end for a faithful animal, but in this unforgiving world, one creature's tragedy was another's salvation. "Eliza," he called out, his voice flat, "we have meat." She came over, her face pale, and stared at the frozen horse. Her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and a terrible, undeniable relief. Food! It was a gruesome miracle. Caleb took out his skinning knife. The work was difficult and grim, his hands stiff and clumsy in the cold as he sawed away at the frozen hide and muscle. He cut thick strips from the flank and haunch, the meat hard as iron. He worked with a detached efficiency, his face a mask of grim determination. This was what survival demanded. There was no room for sentiment. Back inside the cabin, the reality of their meal sank in. Eliza took the frozen strips of meat and put them in their only pot with melted snow. As the water began to heat over the fire, which they had managed to rebuild with the scavenged wood. A gamey, unpleasant odor filled the small space. She stood over the pot, stirring it with a wooden spoon, and began to weep. They were silent tears, tracking clean paths down her soot-stained cheeks. She wept for the poor, dead animal. She wept for the shame of their situation, for the indignity of it all. She wept for the memory of a life where food came from a garden and a smokehouse, not a frozen carcass. She wept for her own weakness, for the loneliness that had become her constant companion. Caleb watched her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. He wanted to comfort her, to say something, but words felt useless, hollow. Instead, he simply took a piece of cloth and gently wiped the soot from her face, his touch surprisingly tender. She flinched but didn't pull away. The horse meat, when they finally ate it, was tough and stringy, but it was sustenance. It was life. The hot broth warmed them from the inside out, replenishing a strength they hadn't realized they had lost. That night, as the relentless snow continued to fall, the shared meal and the shared trauma of the day seemed to break down the last of their reservations. The confinement and the gnawing hunger had twisted them into a new shape, stripping away pretense and leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of who they were. "He sold it for a bottle of whiskey," Eliza said suddenly into the quiet, her voice barely a whisper. She was staring into the flames, her eyes distant. Caleb looked at her, waiting. "My wedding ring," she clarified, her voice trembling slightly. "It was my mother's, simple gold band. It was the only thing I had left of her. Jacob said we needed the money for flour. I found out later from the storekeeper's wife he'd traded it for a bottle of the cheapest whiskey they had. He didn't even look me in the eye when I asked him about it." The confession was a small, sharp stone of pain she had carried alone for years. To speak of it, to give it voice, was to finally share its terrible weight. Caleb listened, his own past rising to meet hers. He found himself telling her more about the man he had shot. His name was Frank, a young man, barely 20, full of liquor and pride. He thought I was cheating him. I wasn't. I tried to walk away, but he wouldn't let it go. Caleb's voice grew quieter, hoarse with memory. When he pulled his gun, everything slowed down. I remember the look in his eyes, not anger, just surprise, like he couldn't believe what he was doing. My gun was in my hand before I even thought about it. The sound, it was so loud in that little room. He shook his head, the ghost of that moment still vivid. I see his face sometimes, when I close my eyes. That surprised look. I didn't just kill a man that night. Eliza, I killed a boy who made a stupid, drunken mistake. They sat in silence, the weight of their spoken secrets filling the space between them. A fragile, unspoken bond began to form in that small, firelit cabin. A connection forged not in affection or desire, but in the crucible of shared suffering. They were two broken pieces of humanity, finding a strange sort of wholeness in each other's damage. Later that night, a new sound pierced the monotony of the wind, a low, hungry cry, answered by another, and then another, a wolf pack. They were close, drawn by the scent of the horse carcass. Eliza's blood ran cold. The sound was the very voice of the wilderness, a reminder of how precarious their small island of survival truly was. Caleb moved instantly. He took his revolver from the mantelpiece, checked its load, then grabbed Eliza's rifle. He went to the door, peering through a small crack in the swirling snow. He could see them, dark, fleeting shapes, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers in the darkness. They were circling the cabin, testing its defenses. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice low and steady. He sat down on the floor, his back against the door, the rifle laid across his lap. He was a sentinel, a guardian standing between her and the hungry dark. Eliza huddled on the cot, watching him. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but seeing him there, so calm and resolute, eased it slightly. He was her protector. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, the howls of the wolves a terrifying lullaby. She woke hours later to silence. The wolves were gone. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the cabin was steeped in a deep, frigid chill. She looked toward the door and saw Caleb. He was still there, sitting upright, the rifle resting against his shoulder. His head had slumped forward onto his chest, and he was fast asleep, utterly exhausted. A fine layer of frost, sparkling in the dim light, had formed on his eyelashes and the stubble of his beard. Seeing him there, so vulnerable and yet so steadfast in his duty to protect her, broke something loose inside her. All the fear, the distrust, the shame she had felt toward him simply melted away. He was not a threat. He was not Jacob. He was just a man, as lost and as haunted as she was, doing his best to survive quietly. She rose from the cot and took the old patchwork quilt that lay folded at its foot. She moved toward him, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. She gently draped the quilt over his shoulders, tucking it around him, as she did. Her fingers brushed against his cheek. His skin was cold, rough with stubble. For the first time, she touched him not out of necessity or desperation, but out of a simple, unthinking impulse of tenderness. It was a fleeting, feather-light touch, but in the frozen silence of that cabin, it felt momentous. In that single, gentle contact, she realized the profound truth of her own transformation. She was no longer afraid of him. The storm raged on, a monotonous, unending siege. But inside the cabin, the emotional barriers had been irrevocably breached. The shared cold, the grim meals, the whispered confessions, and the circling wolves had done what no words ever could. They had bound two solitary, broken souls together, not with ropes of affection, but with the unyielding iron chains of survival. The end of the storm came not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, gradual cessation. One morning, Eliza woke to an unfamiliar sensation. Silence, the ceaseless, maddening howl of the wind had finally died, leaving behind a stillness so absolute it felt heavy, pressing in on the eardrums. She rose from her cot and went to the window, scraping away a thin layer of ice with her fingernail. What she saw stole her breath. The world had been reborn in white. An endless, undulating landscape of pristine snow stretched to the horizon, sculpted by the wind into soft, flowing drifts. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun, a rare and welcome visitor, cast a light so brilliant and sharp it made her eyes water. It was a world of profound silence and blinding white light, beautiful and terrible in its stark purity. It was a blank page, waiting for a story, but it was also a tomb, burying the old world beneath its unblemished surface. The change in the atmosphere was palpable inside the cabin. A fragile, tentative hope began to stir, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the possibility of an ending, of a thaw, seemed real. Caleb felt it too. The restlessness that had been held in check by the storm now surged within him. He was a man made for moving, for open spaces, and the confinement had worn on him. "I'm going to check the barn," he announced, his voice firm. "See what's left of it. And the horse." "Caleb, wait," Eliza cautioned. "You're not strong enough yet." She was right. The diet of tough horse meat and thin broth had kept them alive, but it had not nourished them. They were both weaker than they realized, their bodies running on a reserve of sheer will. "I'll be fine," he insisted, waving off her concern. "Just need to see the state of things." He pulled on his stiff duster and boots and pushed open the newly repaired door. The cold air that rushed in was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stale, smoky air of the cabin. He stepped outside, sinking to his thighs in the deep, powdery snow. Eliza watched him from the doorway, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. He moved slowly. His steps labored as he fought his way through the heavy drifts. He made it to the barn, a small, dark figure against the vast white expanse. He disappeared inside the ruined structure for a few minutes, then re-emerged. His shoulders slumped. The reality of the damage, perhaps, had been worse than he imagined. He started back toward the cabin, but his movements were becoming unsteady. He stumbled once, catching himself, then took a few more faltering steps before his legs gave out completely. He crumpled into the snow, a heap of worn canvas and exhaustion, and did not move. A raw, primal scream of terror caught in Eliza's throat. "Caleb!" She didn't think. She didn't grab her boots or her cloak. She launched herself from the doorway, driven by a pure, unthinking instinct. The shock of the deep, frigid snow on her bare feet was excruciating. 1,000 icy needles piercing her skin, but she barely registered the pain. Her entire being was focused on the still form lying in the snow. She fell to her knees beside him, grabbing his shoulder, her hands shaking. "Caleb, wake up!" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. His face was ashen, his lips blue. "Just tired," he rasped, his breath a white cloud. "You fool!" she sobbed, a mixture of fury and terror in her voice. "You stubborn fool!" In a surreal echo of their first encounter, she found herself having to drag him back to the cabin. He was a dead weight, and she was so much weaker now. She hooked her arms under his, digging her bare heels into the snow, pulling with every ounce of her strength. Her feet were numb, her muscles screamed, but she did not stop. This time, it was different. She was not saving a stranger out of a flicker of pity. She was saving the only other person in her world, the man whose presence had become as essential as the fire in her hearth. His survival was inextricably linked to her own. She finally got him inside, collapsing with him onto the floor, her body trembling, her lungs heaving. She slammed the door shut, then crawled over to him, chafing his frozen hands, tears of relief and pain streaming down her face. Her care for him was no longer a conscious choice. It had become instinctual, a force as powerful and undeniable as a mother's love for her child. And in that desperate, frantic struggle, she realized a profound truth. His presence, his breathing in the quiet of the night, his steady competence in the face of their grim reality, had become her reason to keep fighting. The incident marked a turning point. Caleb's collapse was a stark reminder of their shared fragility. And from that day forward, they operated as a true partnership, a unit of two against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The awkwardness that had defined their initial interactions dissolved, replaced by a quiet, comfortable rhythm. They rebuilt their lives through small, deliberate routines. Each morning, one would tend the fire while the other melted snow for water. They shared the cooking and the cleaning, their movements synchronized in the small space. They mended their worn clothes with a clumsy needle and thread, fixed what was broken, and conserved what was precious. They were building a semblance of a home in the heart of their prison. One afternoon, Caleb took Jacob's old rifle from its pegs on the wall. The firing mechanism was rusted, the stock warped. "This is a good rifle," he said, running a knowing hand over the wood. "Just needs some care." He spent the next 2 days meticulously disassembling, cleaning, and oiling every part with lard, using his skinning knife to scrape away the rust. He worked with a patient, focused intensity that Eliza found herself admiring. When he was done, the rifle looked almost new, its metal gleaming in the firelight. "A woman alone out here needs to know how to use one of these," he said, holding it out to her. He took her outside into the blinding sunlight and taught her how to shoot. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. He stood behind her, his body close to hers, his hands guiding her own. His nearness sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. His voice was low and steady in her ear, a calm anchor in her nervousness. The first time she fired, the recoil slammed into her, and the report of the shot was deafening in the profound silence. But she hit the pine cone he'd set on a distant fence post. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. He was giving her a tool for survival, a measure of power in a world that had rendered her powerless. In return, she taught him something of her own. She had found a small, forgotten sack of flour at the back of the root cellar, caked and hardened, but still usable. It was their greatest treasure. With the meticulous care of an alchemist, she showed him how to break up the hardened flour, how to mix it with water and a pinch of salt, how to knead the sticky dough on a floured board. Her hands, sure and practiced, moved with an easy grace. He watched, fascinated by this small act of creation, this transformation of simple dust into the promise of bread. When the first loaf came out of their makeshift oven, a pot covered with hot coals, the smell that filled the cabin was the smell of civilization, of home, of a life she thought she had lost forever. They ate the bread with the last of the horse meat stew, and for the first time in a long time, they felt truly full. As they were cleaning up, Caleb slipped on a patch of ice near the door, his feet flying out from under him. He landed with a comical thud, a look of pure surprise on his face. Without thinking, Eliza let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in the quiet cabin, that it startled her as much as it did him. Caleb looked up at her from the floor, and a slow, rusty smile spread across his face, followed by a low chuckle. For a single, fleeting moment, the weight of their predicament lifted. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of simple, unadorned humor. Then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The laughter died in their throats. A heavy silence fell between them, charged with a sudden, frightening awareness. They both looked away, a flush rising on their cheeks. The sound of their own happiness had frightened them. It was a fragile, precious thing, and they were terrified of breaking it, terrified of what it might mean. The line between necessity and affection, already blurred, began to disappear entirely. The physical space between them shrank. He would linger near the hearth when she was cooking, his shoulder almost brushing hers. She no longer flinched or pulled away when he passed by her in the tight quarters. Their conversations deepened, moving from the practicalities of survival to their pasts, their lost dreams, their quiet fears. She learned he had once hoped to own a small plot of land, a few head of cattle, a life of peace. He learned she had once dreamed of having children, of a garden full of flowers, of a home filled with warmth and laughter. They were two halves of a shared loneliness, finding a strange and unexpected solace in each other's company. One night, the wind picked up again, a mournful whistle through the gaps in the roof they had yet to fully repair. They sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. Eliza watched the flames dance, her heart heavy with a thought that had been growing for days, a thought that both thrilled and terrified her. The thaw would come, eventually. The snow would melt, the world would open up again, and he would leave. The prospect of being truly alone again, after this, was a cold, hollow ache in her chest. "When the snow melts," she began, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, "you'll be on your way." Caleb didn't look at her. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "That's the plan." "To the logging camps," she said. "I suppose." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I don't want you to go." The words were a quiet confession, spoken to the fire, but they filled the entire cabin. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing she had ever said. Caleb turned his head slowly to look at her. His face was a mask of conflict, his blue eyes turbulent with emotions she could not read. She saw guilt there, and a deep, profound sorrow. And something else, something that looked like desire, a desire he was fighting with all his might. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and strained, "I'm no good for staying. I've got ghosts that follow me. Trouble finds me. I'm a drifter. It's all I know how to be. You're building a life here. You don't need my kind of trouble." It was a warning, He was trying to protect her, to push her away for her own good. A year ago, she would have listened. She would have retreated behind her walls of pride and fear. But she was not the same woman. She had survived the winter, survived starvation, survived a loneliness so profound it had nearly erased her. She would not survive losing him. She rose from her stool and moved to stand before him. He remained seated, looking up at her, his expression pained. Without a word, she leaned down and gently pressed her forehead against his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her skin, a rhythm that had become the sound of her own survival. It was an act of complete surrender, of absolute trust. It was her way of saying that she did not care about his ghosts, that his trouble was a price she was willing to pay. The simple, tender gesture broke the last of his restraint. A shudder ran through his body. A sound that was half a groan, half a sob, escaped his lips. His hands came up to cup her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and she saw all of his conflict, all of his longing, laid bare. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet, drawing her with him, and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was not one of wild passion or pent-up lust. It was hesitant, restrained, almost painful in its tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, of shared hardship and unspoken gratitude. It was the gentle, trembling acknowledgement of a truth that had grown between them in the frozen silence, that in the heart of a brutal, unforgiving winter, against all odds, they had found not just survival, but something that felt terrifyingly, wonderfully, like life. For a few precious days, they lived in a fragile, suspended peace. The world outside remained a silent expanse of white, but inside the cabin, a tentative warmth had begun to take root, a warmth that had little to do with the fire. They moved in a rhythm of shared chores and quiet companionship, the space between them no longer charged with tension, but with a palpable, unspoken tenderness. The kiss had changed everything. It was a seal on their shared history, an acknowledgement of the bond forged in the crucible of the storm. They were no longer just survivors. They were partners, their lives intertwined in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. This fragile peace was shattered on a cold, bright afternoon by the sound of approaching horses. It was a sound so alien after the long silence that they both froze, their heads snapping up. Eliza was kneading a small portion of dough, and her hand stopped, covered in flour. Caleb, who was mending a split in his boot leather, slowly rose to his feet, his eyes instantly wary, his hand instinctively moving toward the mantel where his revolver lay. Through the window, they saw two figures on horseback picking their way slowly through the deep snow. They were broad-shouldered men in heavy sheepskin coats, rifles resting in scabbards beside their saddles. They looked hard and weathered, their face chapped red by the wind. Their eyes narrowed as they surveyed the small, isolated homestead. "Neighbors?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Eliza shook her head, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "I don't know them. The closest ranch is 10 miles east. They have no reason to be out this way." The men dismounted, their boots crunching on the packed snow. They moved with a proprietary air, their gaze sweeping over the repaired door, the scavenged woodpile, the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. One of them, a thick-set man with a heavy beard, strode to the door and pounded on it with a gloved fist, the sound like a hammer blow against their quiet world. Caleb looked at Eliza, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He opened the door a crack, his body blocking the entrance. "Afternoon," the bearded man said, his voice a gruff baritone. He peered past Caleb, his eyes taking in the interior of the cabin, lingering for a moment on Eliza. "We're looking for some horses. 4 of them. Went missing from our spread a few weeks back, just before the storm hit. Figured whoever took them might have gotten holed up by the weather. Haven't seen any horses, Caleb said, his tone even, non-committal. Or any people, for that matter. The second man, leaner and with cold, reptilian eyes, spoke up. We heard talk of a drifter seen in these parts. Man answering to your description. His gaze was sharp, accusatory. He looked Caleb up and down. You got a name? A muscle tightened in Caleb's jaw. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but he knew lying would only deepen their suspicion. Caleb Boone. The two men exchanged a look. It was a look of grim satisfaction, of a suspicion confirmed. Boone, the bearded man repeated, tasting the name. That name's familiar. Heard it connected to a robbery over at the Black Creek mining camp. A payroll snatched. A guard shot. That sound about right to you? The accusation hung in the frigid air. A poison that instantly contaminated their sanctuary. Caleb's past. The very trouble he had warned her about had found them. You've got the wrong man, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. That so? The lean man sneered. Funny, the description fits. And here you are, shacked up in a widow's cabin miles from anywhere. Looks mighty suspicious to us. Before Caleb could answer, Eliza moved. She stepped forward from the shadows of the cabin and stood squarely between Caleb and the two men. Her face was pale, but her chin was high, her eyes blazing with a protective fire that stunned them all. Most of all, Caleb. He's been here with me through the entire storm, she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He was half dead when I found him. He's no thief. Now get off my property. The bearded man let out a short, ugly laugh. He looked past her at Caleb, then back at her, his eyes full of a coarse, insulting appraisal. Well, now, looks like the drifter found himself a warm place to wait out the winter. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the clean white snow. We heard stories about you, Mrs. Ward, the grieving widow, all alone out here. His voice dropped into a conspiratorial, mocking tone. Looks like you ain't so alone after all. Just the widow who warms her bed with strays. The insult struck Eliza with the force of a physical slap. A hot flush of shame and fury burned her cheeks. She could feel the weight of the town's judgment, the cruel whispers she had always imagined, now given voice by this brutish stranger. But instead of making her retreat, the vile words solidified her resolve. She did not flinch. She stood her ground, her small frame a defiant shield in front of Caleb. Caleb's face had gone rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He took a step forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. You'll take that back. Or what? Boone? The lean man challenged, his hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol at his hip. You'll shoot us down like you did that payroll guard? The situation was escalating, spiraling toward violence. Caleb knew it. He saw the cold certainty in their eyes. They had come looking for a thief, and they were determined to find one. Any bloodshed here would fall on Eliza's head. They would call him a murderer, and her his accomplice. He could not, would not, let that happen. With a visible effort, he reined in his anger. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. There's no need for trouble, he said, his voice strained. He unbuckled his gun belt and held it out. Take it. We can ride into town and talk to the sheriff. Settle this peaceably. The bearded man grinned, a triumphant, predatory expression. Smart choice. But as he reached for the gun, a sharp, metallic click cut through the air. Everyone froze. Eliza was standing just inside the doorway, and in her hands was the rifle Jacob had neglected, the rifle Caleb had repaired for her. She held it with a steady, practiced grip, the stock braced against her shoulder, just as he had taught her. The barrel was aimed squarely at the bearded man's chest. I said, she repeated, her voice low and trembling but absolutely clear. Get off my property. Caleb stared at her, his mind reeling. This was not the timid, haunted woman he had found freezing in the snow. This was a she-wolf defending her den, fierce and uncompromising. The two ranchers were momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of her action. Then, the lean man's face twisted into a mask of rage. "You foolish woman," he snarled, reaching for his own gun. "You'll hang right alongside him." He never cleared the leather. The crack of the rifle was explosive in the winter stillness. It was not a warning shot. The lean man cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and staggered back, clutching his thigh where a dark red stain was already blossoming on his trousers. He fell to his knees in the snow, his face a mask of shock and pain. The bearded man stared at his partner, then at the smoking barrel of Eliza's rifle, his bravado evaporating in an instant. He saw the look in her eyes, not of fear or panic, but of cold, hard resolution. He scrambled to help his wounded companion, half dragging him back toward the horses. "You'll pay for this," he yelled, his voice laced with fear. "The law will hear about this. They'll see you both swing." He managed to haul his partner onto a horse, then mounted his own and spurred them away, leaving behind nothing but a trail of blood and churning snow. Silence descended once more, heavier and more menacing than before. Eliza stood frozen, the rifle still in her hands, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. The smell of gunpowder hung sharp and acrid in the air. She began to tremble, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a hollow, shaking terror in its place. Caleb moved to her, gently taking the rifle from her nerveless fingers. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of awe and a terrible, dawning dread. "Eliza," he breathed, "what have you done?" "I protected what was mine," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They'll be back," he said urgently, his mind racing. "They'll go straight to the sheriff. They'll have a posse. A wounded man is all the proof they'll need. They'll call it attempted murder. We have to leave. Now!" He began to move about the cabin, gathering what little they had. A blanket, the rest of the flour. His revolver. "We can head north, through the mountains. They won't expect us to go into the high country. We can find a place to lay low until spring." But Eliza didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, staring at the small, familiar objects in her cabin, the worn rocking chair, the patched quilt on her cot, the rough-hewn table. This place was more than just wood and stone. It was the only thing she had ever fought for, the only piece of the world that was truly hers. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not running." Caleb stopped, turning to face her. "What are you talking about? We don't have a choice." "I've run my whole life," she said, a fierce, desperate light in her eyes. "I was run out of my family home when I married Jacob. He ran us into the ground with his debts. I will not be run out of my own home again. Not by them, not by anyone." "Eliza, this is my fault," he pleaded, his voice ragged. "This is my trouble, and it's found you. Please, don't let your pride be the end of you. The law won't listen. They'll see you as an outlaw's woman." "Then let them," she retorted, her voice rising. "I don't care what they call me. This is my home. I will not abandon it." He saw the unyielding set of her jaw and knew he could not change her mind. A terrible choice loomed before him. To stay was to be captured, to be hanged, and to see her dragged down with him. To leave was to abandon her to face the consequences of an action she had taken for him. His own survival instinct, honed by years on the run, screamed at him to go. He couldn't die here. He couldn't let it end like this. "Then I'm going alone," he said, his voice heavy with a grief that felt like a physical weight. "I won't be the reason they put a rope around your neck." He didn't wait for her to reply. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, grabbed a blanket, and walked out the door, not daring to look back. Each step away from her, away from the cabin, felt like a betrayal. The brilliant white of the snow seemed to mock him, a vast, empty future stretching before him. He had gone maybe 50 yards when he heard a sound behind him. He stopped, but did not turn. It was the sound of the cabin door opening, and then of someone struggling through the snow. "Caleb, wait!" Her voice was a raw, broken cry that tore through his heart. He slowly turned around. She was stumbling toward him, clutching the old patchwork quilt to her chest. She wasn't wearing a coat, and her bare feet were sinking into the snow. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. Her pride, her fierce defense of her home, had finally crumbled, replaced by a fear that was far greater, the fear of being alone again. She reached him and collapsed against his chest, her body racked with sobs. "Don't leave me," she wept, her voice muffled against his duster. "Please, I can't survive alone anymore." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his own resolve breaking. Her words were the simple, devastating truth. They had survived the winter because they had each other. Alone, they were nothing. He lifted her into his arms, her bare feet dangling, and carried her back to the cabin just long enough to grab her boots and cloak. Then, together, they turned their backs on the only home she had ever known and walked away, two fugitive figures disappearing into the vast, unforgiving white. They found refuge in an abandoned line shack, a tiny, dilapidated structure used by linemen in the summer months. It was a miserable place, hardly more than a box of rotting planks, with gaps in the walls that let in the wind and the snow. The cold here was sharper, more profound than anything they had endured in her cabin. There was no hearth, no proper bed, only the frozen dirt floor. Here, in this desolate, frozen box, with the law behind them and an uncertain future ahead, everything was stripped away but their desperate, fierce need for each other. Their love, born in quiet tenderness, now turned sharp and desperate. They clung to each other beneath the thin blankets, not just for warmth, but for life itself. His touch was no longer just gentle. It was a fierce, protective claim. Her embrace was not just soft. It was an anchor in a world that would rather see them freeze. They were two outlaws, two survivors, clinging to the only source of heat left in their world, each other. Their time in the line shack was a fever dream of cold and desperation. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival, their world shrinking to the few feet of frozen floor space and the shared warmth of their bodies beneath a thin blanket. They spoke little, their energy conserved for the essential tasks of melting snow and rationing the last of their food. Their love, stripped of all tenderness, had become a raw, fierce, protective instinct. They were two wolves in a frozen den, guarding each other against a hostile world. But the world found them. They were tracked not by their footprints, which the constant wind erased, but by the simple, brutal logic of survival. The posse, led by the bearded rancher, knew that fugitives would seek shelter. They checked every abandoned shack, every trapper's lean-to, every possible refuge in the vast, empty landscape. The door to the shack burst open one morning in a shower of splintered wood, and the small space was instantly filled with armed, grim-faced men. Caleb was on his feet in a heartbeat, his revolver in his hand, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. Before he could even raise the gun, he was struck from behind and driven to the floor. Eliza screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror, and threw herself over him, a human shield against the boots and rifle butts. They dragged her off him, her fingers clawing at the rough woolen coats of her attackers. "Sss, we found our murderer," the bearded rancher declared, his voice thick with triumph, as two men hauled a dazed and bleeding Caleb to his feet. "He's not a murderer," Eliza cried, struggling against the man who held her. "We were defending ourselves. You have to listen." Her pleas were met with cold, deafening silence. They bound Caleb's hands behind his back and looped a rope around his neck, a cruel leash. They ignored Eliza's desperate cries for mercy, her pleas for reason. To them, the matter was already settled. They had found their outlaw, and justice on the frontier was a swift and brutal affair. They planned to hang him from the nearest sturdy tree as soon as they reached town. The journey back was a slow agonizing march of humiliation. They dragged Caleb behind a horse, forcing him to stumble through the deep snow. Eliza was made to walk beside him, a prisoner in all but name, her every step a testament to her shame in the eyes of the posse. The town was a small, hard-scrabble collection of log buildings huddled in a narrow valley, a place that seemed to suck the very light from the sky. As the posse rode down the single muddy, snow-choked street with their prisoner in tow, people emerged from the saloon, the general store, the blacksmith's shop. Doors opened, faces appeared in windows. A crowd began to gather, their expressions a grim mixture of curiosity and cruel judgment. The whispers started almost immediately, a low, venomous hiss that followed Eliza like a swarm of insects. "That's her, the Ward widow. Took up with an outlaw, they say." "No good ever came from that woman. Husband freezes to death, and she fills his bed before he's even cold in the ground. Look at her, no shame at all." Each word was a stone cast at her, each hostile stare a physical blow. The shame she had fought so hard to overcome, the shame she thought she had buried, rose up and threatened to suffocate her. She bowed her head, pulling her cloak tighter, wishing the frozen ground would open up and swallow her whole. They dragged Caleb to the center of the town, where a makeshift gallows had already been erected, a single thick beam supported by 2 posts. The town sheriff, a weary-looking man with a tin star pinned to his coat, seemed to be presiding over the affair with a distinct lack of enthusiasm, a man merely carrying out the will of the mob. They threw Caleb at the foot of the gallows, his body broken and half frozen. He looked up, his eyes searching for Eliza in the crowd. When he found her, he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent plea for her to run, to save herself. But something inside Eliza had broken. Seeing him there, so utterly defeated, with a rope around his neck, and hearing the cruel, self-righteous whispers of the townsfolk, the very people who had watched her struggle and offered no help, extinguished the last flicker of her fear and shame. All that was left was a white-hot, purifying rage. She straightened her back. She let the hood of her cloak fall away, revealing her face to the jeering crowd. And then, in a move that stunned everyone to silence, she bent down and deliberately, defiantly, pulled off her boots. She cast them aside and took a step forward, her bare feet sinking into the biting, slushy snow. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was an act of madness, of pure penance, but she did not falter. With her head held high, she began to walk. Each step on the frozen ground was an agony, a searing pain that shot up her legs, but she did not cry out. She walked through the parted crowd, a barefoot specter of defiance, her eyes fixed on the gallows, on the man she loved. She stormed through the crowd and stopped directly in front of the sheriff, her small frame radiating a power that no one had ever seen in her before. "You are about to murder an innocent man," she announced, her voice ringing out in the cold, clear air. The crowd erupted in jeers and catcalls. "She's his woman! Of course she'd say that!" Eliza ignored them. She looked the sheriff squarely in the eye. "This man is Caleb Boone, and he is no thief. He found his way to my cabin half dead in the blizzard. He did not ask for my help. I gave it. He saved my life when my fireplace collapsed and the cold nearly took me. He chopped my wood. He fixed my door. He protected me from wolves." Her voice grew stronger, imbued with the unshakable power of truth. "Those men," she said, turning and pointing a trembling finger at the ranchers, "came to my home looking for trouble. They accused him, they threatened him, and they insulted me with words no woman should have to hear. I shot one of them, not him. I did it to protect my home and to protect a good man from bullies who came looking for violence. He is not an outlaw. He is just a man trying to live. A better man than any of you who stand here whispering and judging." She offered herself as a witness, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, challenging them. The initial jeers had died down, replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence. They saw not the fallen woman of their gossip, but a woman of extraordinary courage, bearing her soul, sacrificing her own reputation for the sake of justice, her bare feet a testament to the burning sincerity of her words. Her raw, desperate courage had shamed them. The sheriff, who had been watching her intently, seemed to be moved. He looked from Eliza's fierce, pleading face to Caleb's battered form, and then to the smug faces of the ranchers. A seed of doubt had been planted. "Hold on," he said, raising a hand to the men preparing the rope. Just then, a boy ran up, waving a piece of paper. It was a telegraph, just arrived from the next county. The sheriff took it, his brow furrowed as he read. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "It says here the men responsible for the Black Creek robbery were caught 2 days ago, near Willow Creek. A signed confession names a man named Jedediah Stone. It says nothing of a Caleb Boone." He looked at the bearded rancher. "Seems you had the wrong man all along." He then found new evidence that the robbery was another man's doing. A murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of shock and dawning guilt. The sheriff walked over and personally cut the ropes that bound Caleb's hands. "You're a free man, mister Boone, though I reckon you're half dead from the cold and this town's hospitality." Caleb struggled to his feet, his body trembling violently. His gaze locked on Eliza. She stood, swaying, the last of her strength gone, the pain in her frozen feet suddenly overwhelming. He staggered toward her, and she fell into his arms, her body racked with great, shuddering sobs. The shame, the fear, the loneliness, it all came pouring out. "I don't care," she wept into his chest, her words a final, triumphant surrender. "I don't care what they say. I don't care about the shame anymore." He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, his own tears freezing on his cheeks. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Together, scarred but alive, they returned to her cabin. The journey was slow, Caleb leaning on her for support, her feet wrapped in rags. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had endured. When they finally saw the small, snow-covered cabin, it looked like the most beautiful sight in the world. It was not a prison or a place of shame. It was their sanctuary. It was home. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came with a fierce, beautiful urgency. The snow melted into rushing, joyous rivers. The frozen ground softened, breathing out the damp, loamy scent of thawing earth. Small, green shoots, tenacious and determined, pushed their way toward the sun. The world was being washed clean, reborn. So were they. In the quiet days that followed, they healed. Caleb's wounds faded, and the haunted look in his eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet peace. Eliza's heart, so long frozen with grief and fear, began to thaw. They fell into a new rhythm, one not of survival, but of life. Caleb found Jacob's old plow and began to turn the dark, rich earth of the small plot behind the cabin. He planted seeds, corn, beans, potatoes, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate care. He was putting down roots, investing in a future, turning the barren land of her past into a garden of their own. Eliza baked bread again. The smell of it, warm and life-affirming, filled the small cabin. It was a smell of hope, of domesticity, of a life being rebuilt from the ashes. One morning, just as the sun was cresting the mountains, casting a soft, golden glow across the valley, Eliza stood on the porch, watching him work. He looked up and saw her, and a slow, easy smile touched his lips. He walked over to her, wiping the dirt from his hands, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm staying, Eliza," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "For good this time." She closed her eyes, a single, happy tear tracing a path down her cheek. The long winter was finally over. The story ends here, with them standing together in the quiet dawn, sharing a simple, profound warmth beneath the same roof that had once nearly frozen them both. Survivors, lovers, and the last two souls standing against the wild. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.